Thank you, Claire, for your welcome and introduction. And I'd also like to thank all of the delegates for attending and being with us for Unit 4 today. So we'll make a start. And for planning purposes, there will be a short wellbeing break for those of you who need one at approximately the halfway mark, just around the hour. So today we are going to focus on Literature Paper 4 and how we may deliver it effectively. This training is for teachers of the Pearson Edexcel English Literature Specification. We'll be looking at the assessment objectives and looking at how we may use them when we're looking at examination papers or practicing and scaffolding with students. We'll be analysing some recent questions and think about how the questions may match the objectives. We'll be investigating how questions have been answered, looking back at previous exam series. We'll discuss strategies for teaching, trying to make sure that students can access questions and target those particular assessment objectives. And hopefully there will be a chance to network and share ideas with other delegates. Going through with our general information first. Thinking of our context, hopefully candidates will be developing and building upon understanding from GCSE or IGCSE. Candidates will be joining us from other qualifications and specifications, but the idea is that it's building upon prior learning, prior skills. The international A level is quite similar to the domestic qualification, and it's useful to note that some of the resources can be interchangeable. So when you're working with the websites and looking for assessment or teaching and learning resources, it can be useful to make that cross-reference. Qualification is aiming to blend the knowledge of the text and the skills in analysis and interpretation in an integrated and coherent way. This can be treated as a modular qualification, with some candidates taking the whole AS in year 12, although many do prefer taking it as a linear at the end of the 2 years. Therefore, it's very flexible in the terms of approach. This is the fourth and final meeting of the Delivering Effectively series, and we've been through units 1 to 3 in prior sessions. And today our focus will be Shakespeare and pre-1900 poetry, and we'll be focusing in on the demands of the paper in one moment. We just need to look briefly at how the assessment objectives are balanced and weighted across the qualification, and noting that we do have those that maybe have a lighter balance, but are still sort of an integral part. So some questions will be looking at AO4 connection or AO5 critical interpretations. Looking at today, we have a section A, section B, section 1 or 2. We can see that in the section A response, we're not necessarily looking to connect, but we are testing AOs 1, 2, 3 and 5. And then in section 2, when we're looking at the set poetry anthologies, we are looking at all assessment objectives. In terms of why assessment objectives are important, they are similarly worded across various specifications and qualifications, and they are to allow for consistency from one spec to another, to allow for fairness, to allow for clarity in terms of candidates knowing what is required of them, the idea of the subject domain and the aspects that we test, and validity therefore should be achieved. And it will give a shared reference point for those who set the papers, those who examine, the teachers, and importantly, the candidates. And our assessment process runs pretty much at this stage almost year round. So focusing in then on WET04, Shakespeare and pre-1900 poetry. And just to note, if you have not got direct access to your resources to hand, there is a link available in the chat that will enable you to get to the resources referenced today. So if you haven't got those easily to hand, if you check through chat, that link will take you directly to the resource bank for today's meeting. So the examination is 2 hours with open book, obviously clean copies, with 2 equally weighted sections, A and B. We have, as we say, actually say equal, it's 25 and 35 with the weighting through for the poetry. We have another visit to Shakespeare for those of you who've worked on Shakespeare in the AS units. We've got Measure for Measure, Taming of the Shrew, Hamlet and King Lear. 2 questions will be made available per each play, and the candidates will choose to respond to one. Section B will allow for 3 selections of pre-1900 poetry, and the choice is between the metaphysical poetry collection of Burrow, the romantic verse from David Wright, and the Oxford Book of Victorian Verse, Christopher Ricks. Specified poems can be found on pages 53 to 56 of the specification. And we will sort of revisit that briefly in the section B, but it is important. Candidates do occasionally veer away from the set poems. We do encourage them not to do this. So we'll begin with Shakespeare. And thinking about how the paper works, we will be looking to see that the following features of drama should be covered. Characterization is key and forms a focus for many questions. There's also the aspect of form, dramatic form, and structure within scenes and across the text as a whole. We're looking for relevant or significant imagery, symbolism, and motif. Candidates can be looking at language choices. We will return to this momentarily. There is a danger when candidates remain just with language that it can stay on the surface, but clearly we are looking at how the language contributes to meaning. Themes will be a point of question, and we may be looking also at the overall tone and mood created. Particularly with this paper, we are wanting to think about dramatic presentation, so it may be relevant to discuss stage direction or other elements of stagecraft, such as lighting, sets, and props. It is desirable that we think of Shakespeare's texts as works that are seen in performance as well as read. Throughout the spec, we know that candidates should aim to show their knowledge and understanding of how Shakespeare uses his form to shape the meaning in texts and evoke responses in the audience. So that sort of is a key aspect. So I'll just bear with you for the chat. Oh, the PowerPoint has stopped sharing. Okay. Yes, Elena, I'll check with that because there may have been an issue with that slide. So I will check with Pearson, and I will just put the PowerPoint again. So if the PowerPoint has stopped sharing, we can reshare. Okay, so hopefully now you will be seeing the PowerPoint once again. So for those who have sort of mentioned, if you just bear with me, and you should now be able to see the PowerPoint once again. We have the sense that they need to show knowledge and understanding of how Shakespeare uses form to shape the meaning in the texts. We also have the idea of showing knowledge and understanding of the range of ways that we can read and experience drama texts, responding critically. Yes, I've just said, Elena, I do apologise. That slide was from a set that has been pre-provided. And I'd mentioned earlier, it is equal weights. So I think that one has travelled across, and I do apologise for that. So 25, 25. And as you've already noted, do stay with the mark scheme with that one. Okay, so we have knowledge and understanding of the context in which the drama texts are written, and understanding of how the context can influence meaning. And to respond to and evaluate the drama text, drawing on interpretations by audience and reader, and attitudes and values that may be expressed in those texts. We're hoping that candidates can communicate fluently, accurately, and effectively the knowledge, understanding, and evaluation of the drama texts. We're looking to use the literary critical concepts and the terminology with understanding and discrimination. And we're hoping to make appropriate use of conventions of writing in the literary study, referring accurately and appropriately to texts and sources. So thinking about the subject domain and how we deliver and what we could build on from WET02 in the previous sessions. Thinking about whether we front load from prior learning or whether we work through with the text itself. So the idea of how we might make use of those models. So with today's session, we will be focusing mainly on Hamlet questions. Later in poetry, as Elena has drawn a focus to, do recall it is 25-25. So that was sort of an issue with that slide. So we will sort of address that. The slides will read 25-25. But looking at the Hamlet question as an example, we'll be looking at 3 questions from various section A's. thinking about the questions and the challenges they offer, but also the opportunities and what you might choose to do. How might we begin a response? How might a response end? This is quite critical. The idea of the journey that the candidate takes and how they may clinch an argument or prove their thesis. And comparing our choices as we go through. So we have a steer here, and this is kind of typical of format. We'll have a steer or potential interpretation followed by the task itself. So it's sort of a two-part structure, and we'll see this in comment to all of the Shakespeare questions. So we'll have this here that performance and interpretation of Gertrude's tends to be overly negative, and we're giving this steer to invite candidates to challenge it or sort of to present a critical position. So we have the reference to performance and interpretation. So the idea of not just words, but from page to stage. And the sense then to what degree would they tend to be overly negative? And that may sort of again invite the candidates to explore nuance. So we're inviting them to maybe challenge this steer and to speak back to the idea of how Gertrude is presented. And it's this sense of giving one particular perspective in the hope that that will actually open candidates out to discussing a range of interpretations or a way of exploring character. And 25 marks are available there. Then on our second option, we have Hamlet offering a considerable depth of suspense and tension for audience to enjoy. And with our suspense and tension questions, we can work with these in two ways. We can clearly identify points that are points of suspense or dramatic tension that builds to an engagement with the audience. And then candidates may wish to take that step back and consider it in terms of structurally how suspense and tension is achieved over the wider play. And the sense of where we have the suspense, where we have the tension, the nature of it, and how it's developed through stagecraft. Once again, candidates are reminded that they must include contextual factors. And then question 5 from 23 paper is a question about sort of response and evaluation. The core of Hamlet's fascination lies in the exploration of the unnatural. And there's a fair amount to unpick in this question. The sense of what might we mean by fascination in terms of audience response? What is drawing us here? Is it drawing to a particular character? Is it the sense of the presentation of the supernatural? And as it says here, the unnatural? And what can unnatural include? Are we purely looking at supernatural, or are we looking at behaviours? Are we looking at relationships that are deemed unnatural or taboo? So it's up to the candidate to maybe select their frame and then think about, to what extent does that contribute to this sense of fascination? And fascination we might think about in terms of dramatic effect, dramatic presentation. And as we say, with exploration, think about the different meanings of the term unnatural. So if we just pause with those for a moment, we have a question on the presentation of Gertrude, a question on the presentation of suspense and tension throughout the play, and then a question on the unnatural. And if we think about guidance that we might initially give our candidates, what might you encourage a candidate to consider or explore if we think about this idea of how to open the response? So we've got the selection of the presentation of the character of Gertrude, the presentation of moments of suspense or tension, and the idea of what we might deem the unnatural and what that might include. So if we were guiding a candidate towards beginning a plan or beginning a response to any of those three, if we could ask you to contribute into the chat box. So you might just want to indicate, is it Gertrude, tension or unnatural? And what would your sort of first piece of guidance be to the candidate in terms of their maybe immediate response to the steer and the task? I'll just give everyone a few moments to gather their thoughts. So as I mentioned for the question on screen, I might be minded to ask my candidates to consider how they are going to frame or define unnatural and what would they include alongside that term. Okay, thank you, Elena. We've got the idea of with the character question, thinking about the character in relation to the theme and the shift, as well as the impact upon audience. So it's building that first part of the response, isn't it? It's the sense of taking it beyond just a character study and thinking about it, as you said, as dramatic presentation, how it relates to, how it conveys or refines the theme, and that shift, as we say, in perspective, where that might occur. And the impact can be both in terms of dramatic function and then also, as we say, the audience response, how it evokes emotional response or how it might aid audiences' understanding of the theme. So we have a response from Elena for the Gertrude question. And then anyone want to sort of add any comments on how you might advise a candidate to approach a tension and structure question, or this idea of, while this question on screen, it has a certain challenge, it can give the candidates something to get their teeth into. The idea of, what are we terming non-natural? We have, as we said, supernatural, but we also have the sense of unnatural relationships, unnatural desires, the states of Denmark, the sense that there's something unnatural at the core or corruption. And then that word fascination, making the question then an extra layer of challenge, that sense of what might we mean by fascination, fascination in the play, fascination in particular characters, how the audience react or engage. But if anyone would like to suggest tension, which I know students can veer away from. So if you're working with a student and they get a sort of tension and structure question, and it needn't be Hamlet, it could be one of the other choices. What would our first piece of advice be, maybe to those students, to advise them not to be so scared of tension questions, because I know sometimes that they can run from those. And it can be occasionally tricky to unpick in terms of dramatic function where that source of tension comes from. It can be built between character interaction. It can be a moment that is sort of a moment of suspense and how the dramatist creates that moment or ratchets up the suspense and tension. So it can be looking at it from a very technical aspect. It can be the broader sense of tension, as in the sort of sense of social tensions underlying the play. So any takers on the tension question or the unnatural question before we move through? And it's certain one that we can circle back with. So if you are typing, do please continue to type. Yes, there we go. We've got another one coming. We've got our sense then of working with atmosphere, the language, moments of dramatic irony and how that adds to the tension. And then, yes, this sense of when characters exhibit points of tension between themselves and the sense, as you say, of the theme and where it builds as well. So we're thinking what we can see is, those ideas of approaching from multiple angles will get the best level of responses. And again, we have this sense of using the plan. And this is where we can refer back to historic mark schemes and use them in classroom to help students consider about what might make a good plan. So one thing to say about the mark scheme, it's not exhaustive. So if your candidate produces something that's not on the bullet point list of content, that's not to say that it wouldn't be awarded, because we award all information that is relevant and significant to the question. But in terms of sort of reverse engineering and working in class on assessment for learning, we can use those mark schemes, and particularly the indicative content, and actually ask candidates to build upon them, ask them to critically assess the indicative content, ask them if they're surprised by anything that appears on the list. Do they feel there's anything missing or an omission? And it can be this idea of sort of actively involving students with mark schemes and making them part of sort of planning and part of independent revision. And then also peer reviewing. So we can start with the published mark scheme, ask the students to kind of cast a critical eye, and then ask them to compare what other candidates have done and how their plans differ. And then there are things that we can do, like placing them onto the flashcards and using them in later revision later in the course. Or, as we said, that idea of reverse engineer, we could take that plan and we could think about, would there be an additional or an alternative question that we could craft from the plan? And it makes a good basis for practice essays as well, particularly with students maybe who are a little less confident in framing ideas. So taking a question about imagery and symbolism, so one of those questions that's sort of guiding us to technique, but giving a candidate a little bit of freedom in terms of what they wish to discuss. They may wish to discuss the setting and the sense of audience and potentially possible meta-theatrical elements. They might talk about imagery in terms of Hamlet and question of this, the action which a man might play. They might discuss imagery in terms of context, both the conventions of the Elizabethan stage and maybe shared understanding of some imagery and symbolism that is perhaps different to a modern audience. The sense, as we said before, with a character question, we might want to intersect with theme. Likewise here, you might want to think about, where the themes are coming in terms of the symbolism that's repeated or the motif. There could be a possibility of using critical response. So in taking a critic's point of view, the sense of, I mentioned meta-theatre, and the idea of how actually that can be a way into interpreting Hamlet's character. And then thinking about, as we close a response, the overall effectiveness or the significance or the function of the imagery and symbolism selected in presenting the key themes. And this is where the candidate, we're not using I, but it's where we can get the sense of the personal perspective. We can get the sense of where they feel that certain themes take on major significance. And then in terms of how the plan could be improved, one of the things that we may not see is maybe possibly AO3 coverage occasionally in a candidate plan. And how could we address it? We could think about, is there a particular focus on language that could be joined to a context bullet? We could think about then extending work through a language point and then linking it directly with context in the evaluation. Could we get the students to rewrite a particular language bullet to include AO3 content? So later we will be spending more time with AO5 when we're looking particularly at with poetry. And what we're trying to do when we're thinking about AO3 context or AO5 is we're trying to avoid the sort of sense of an add-on. We're trying with AO5 not to just say a ex-critic may say, and we're trying with AO3 not to make sort of generalizations, just saying, Elizabethan or Jacobean theatre and not sort of linking it to a particular point or a particular aspect of the discussion. And here we have another Hamlet question, which could be applied to any of our texts, really. And it's a question on minor characters. And this one, again, is inviting a challenge. So the steer is saying minor characters get in the way of the play, adding nothing worthwhile. And we're hoping that students don't 100% agree with this point, because we're looking to see their sort of review or their interpretation of the function of minor characters. So if we think about this, not just with Hamlet, but with sort of any of the set texts, How might we invite our candidates to explore or potentially challenge this steer? So it's a sense of presentation of minor characters. It happens to be on Hamlet, but we could make this work for pretty much most of the texts. And think about, where would we start? Would we begin by showing an understanding of minor characters? Would we begin with a specific character focus relevant to a specific play? Would we begin with a point where the minor character actually has a highly significant function? So what, again, would you advise your candidates? And if we can just pop the comments into the chat box. And do, as I say, feel free to link it to whichever text that you're working on. So thinking about the role of minor characters. And here we might think, is an individual minor character furthering a plot in some way? Is there a form of subplot where the minor characters are providing, for example, a social critique, or maybe a satirical look, or a mirror to the action in the main plot, or the interactions of main characters? So thinking about this question, what advice could we give the candidates in terms of opening the response? Okay. And yes, I think, Elena, thank you. The idea of a minor as a foil is often the case with Shakespeare, isn't it? Are they a foil? Are they a mirror? Are they reinforcing, or are they challenging? The catalyst, in terms of, is it something to do with the inciting action? The contextual elements, we think back to something like the porter in Macbeth. It can be quite an unwieldy scene, but it does bring up concerns about equivocation. So thinking about that, and then thinking, we've talked a lot about how we open our responses. For those who sort of need a chance or an opportunity to comment, any advice you might give your candidates on, having worked their way through certain aspects of their minor character, how they may conclude an argument, or the idea of the killer close? So we're thinking across all texts now. We'll ignore the fact that this is a Hamlet question, because we can apply this to any of the texts. And thinking about, how do we end? How do we finish these responses? We're trying to move away from simply sort of reiterating the ideas of an introduction. So where might a candidate go? What might they try to do as they complete their response? In just a moment to pop your thoughts in the chat box. We could go with our sense of potentially the audience response, and if that has changed over time, and that would certainly secure our sense of integrating the assessment objectives. So we would be bringing in our context as we close our arguments. Certainly, I've mentioned before this question, if we look at the steer, and remembering that the steer is there to help students. It's there for candidates to suggest a perspective that they may either agree with to some extent, or strongly disagree with. But in this particular one, the steer, hopefully we would get a degree of challenge. We would hopefully find that candidates do not think that minor characters simply get in the way of a play's central concern. And we might, see candidates exploring that sense to which actually they do, as we say, provide either that foil or that mirror of those central concerns and themes. And there is a potential ending with audience response. There is a potential thinking about authorial intention, the idea of the role or the function of those particular characters that the candidate has selected in the particular play. And it's an idea of, we're not introducing brand new arguments, but we want this sense of, as we call it, this potential killer close. If the students can show in those final comments that they are trying to integrate their thoughts, that they are trying to pull together a view about character, a view about theme, a view about, writer's craft, and that goes alongside the audience response, so what is Shakespeare doing and how are the audience or audiences, plural, responding? And that sort of is what we're trying to encourage them to do at every step, at every level. And then we have, again, the sense of remembering that it is the second part of the question that is the core. The second part is the task. But we do have our steer again to suggest a particular critical point, a particular perspective, and it enables candidates across the mark range to achieve. The sense of the steer is to give everyone sort of a moment of thought or a moment of interpretation, and then the candidates are answering the point. In this particular question, it's about presentation of self-interest, whereas the steer mentions the sense of outstanding insight into a power of self-interest. So the steer has a sort of evaluative element to it with the word outstanding. But our question is asking about the presentation of self-interest, and it's using terms ways in which will stay the same throughout the questions. And it's suggesting not just the idea of the how, but the to what end or the for what purpose. And the sense of, can we argue against it? What elements are considered to be signs of self-interest? What elements are beyond that, are moving into the larger sphere? So thinking about the ways in which it's presented, it is trying to keep candidates focused on text as drama. And the sense is that make sure that we are looking at how as opposed to what. We find candidates at level 1, level 2, do seem to slip into or get sort of into a digression where they're telling us what we're being shown as opposed to how is being shown. And obviously we do need to sometimes cite or put a particular example in context, but we must keep that context brief. We mustn't let it become too descriptive. We're more interested in sort of how things are being done and for what purpose. And the sense of this outstanding aspect, it is to encourage the discussion. It is to encourage maybe a degree of pushback or a degree of challenge. And then the sense, as we always say, that we're addressing the second part of the task, in the light of this statement, certainly can be informed by the first. The steer or the prompt is there to get candidates to engage with that particular aspect of criticism, but they are free to sort of interpret and frame this sense of presentation of self-interest in whichever way they choose. We're wanting an argument, basically, is what we're trying to say. And we have found actually that praise to centres, that the strength that we have seen again and again in recent sittings is the sense of how people are making use of stage versions, recording of stage versions, and using those as a way into an exploration of authorial intention, audience response. And a reminder that we know that not everyone has the opportunity to see adaptations live, and that there are resources there in terms of if live streaming, if we're lucky enough, or we do get, our good old friend YouTube, someone suddenly has some recordings there, and these are acceptable. If these are screened performances, these are sort of acceptable. And it's the sense of, is it relevant? So again, we're hoping that candidates don't describe just what they've seen, but they think about, how was a particular aspect presented in a version they've seen and how that might actually open up an interpretation. And it needs, as we said, to be pertinent. We do occasionally get candidates who are working very hard to tell us or show us that they've sort of seen a range of adaptations, but it's the idea of making a particular comment pertinent and relevant to a particular question. So we're going to have a look at a candidate who has done this quite effectively. And it's the fascination question, the idea of the exploration of the unnatural and the fascination of the text as a drama. So we'll look at what this candidate has done. Another aspect of Hamlet's character that plays critics have spotlighted as being quite unnatural is nature of feelings about his mother. T.S. Eliot argued Hamlet is dominated by an emotion which is inexpressible because in excess of the facts as they appear, suggesting the depth of his rage about his mother's infidelity, noting it hath made me mad. It's almost unnatural to the point of being inexplicable. Indeed, Hamlet's graphic fixation with his mother's lust, to the point where he visualizes her and Claudius honeying and making love in the nasty sty, and the planting of wretched kisses on her cheek, has prompted Freudian critics like Ernest Jones to argue he can't bring himself to kill Claudius because he did a deed he wanted to do, and Hamlet is both fascinated and disgusted as a result. And many interpretations of the play, like Laurence Olivier's 1948 version, stress incestuous undertones of Hamlet's and his mother's relationship. And it's certainly true that the vivid imagery of Hamlet's rage at the mother does make it seem somewhat unnatural in its excessiveness, and this makes the play all the more intriguing. So the candidate is sort of drawn from examples from the text. They have brought in some academic critical sources, and then they've linked it to a version that they've seen. And they're suggesting that the version that they've seen supports this particular reading. And then they're using it to make the point about, yes, this would support the view. It's unnatural in excessiveness. And then using the word intriguing to match with fascinating. And we do need candidates to comment on language, but we do have that note of caution. Sometimes the lower band, the lower range, candidates will focus in on the language and not much else. And sometimes we get that level of almost sort of a word level analysis or a feature spot, and we sort of lack the sense of the play as a whole, or we lack the sense, as mentioned earlier in the comments, you mentioned the idea of characters shifting at certain points in the play, and we lose that if students are just focusing in too much in terms of a zoom in and too much on singular episodes rather than thinking about the idea of sort of travel across the play. And then thinking about features that make something dramatic, and then extending it into an evaluation of those aspects. So working out, how this idea of performance enriches the sense of character, theme, etc. We do want to see terminology used accurately where possible, but this idea that we don't necessarily need to see, an abundance of it, because that can be a danger too. We don't want to see sort of a wide range of terms, but sometimes being used with a degree of imprecision. It's better sort of to have a focused approach, using the correct terms and terms for dramatic presentation and other aspects of language and figurative language, but used relevantly and pertinently. Things that we do sometimes see, we mentioned endings and the idea of a killer close. We know we are demanding and asking a lot of candidates in a timed response, but it's this sense of keeping that eye on timings and thinking about how that ending can bring together the knowledge and can bring together the candidate's ability to talk about the function and the themes and the sense of both what they believe the authorial intention to be and how that audience or audiences across different times may respond to the particular aspect in focus in the question. And we do understand, we realise that there is a natural tendency to want to rush and get to section B. It can be useful to take the conclusion in isolation. So particularly if candidates are quite confident and have rehearsed or practiced with particular major themes, we may have a lesson or an exercise where we focus in on how we would get that killer closing line. So how we would talk about that particular theme that they're already sort of confident in terms of working with, and think about, okay, if we had to discuss it in association with a past paper question, how would we finish the answer? And we do see candidates still occasionally going back and using the key terms, and it's not an issue in itself, but it's not necessarily recommended. It's not going to get them to show nuance and exploration. But we do have this sense that candidates can show reason and can show organisation, and it can be so enjoyable reading that candidates have lively opinions about what they've studied. But obviously, we're not encouraging just slating the text completely. We'll finish this section with a short marking activity. It's going to be a question from the 2024 summer paper. The mark grid you can find going through the links and resources. It will be the grid from pages 19 and 20. It's going to be script A, and they're answering a question on taming of the shrew. And it's about contrast between appearance and reality. And again, the steer has that aspect where we think about audience response or evaluation when it talks about the main appeal. And we'll give you some time to have a look at that, so a few minutes to read through. We'd ask in chat that you think about which level are we looking at here? You know, what level are we talking about, and why might you have chosen that level? If you're feeling a strong feeling, you may even want to add a mark. But what we'd say is, you know, read through the section A script on script A, and it's a question, as we said, on appearance and reality. It opens with this sentence, so we can locate it. And we're thinking about where would you place this response? And one way we can work through when we're looking at essays under sort of time pressures, we can start with those headline words on the marking grid. So you're thinking about at level 1, you may be quite generalized description. Moving through to level 2, there's still that degree of description and maybe maintaining sort of a straightforward grasp or a general grasp of crafting. 3 is definitely marked by things becoming clear and relevant. Moving through to 4, we're beginning to get this idea of a controlled discussion and this sense of discrimination coming into the work. There's a degree of nuance appearing in terms of the selection the students are making or their ability to move across the assessment objectives. And then for level 5, we're thinking we have a candidate who's being consistently critical and they're being sort of wholly evaluative. That point we made earlier about could we take a language point and then link it quite precisely or competently to a context point. You know, we're looking for that. So you may want to start by sort of looking at headline words, and then you don't necessarily have to place it in a level, but if we were thinking about best fit, or if we think a piece has got characteristics of more than one level, we can then look at those sub-bullet points for each of the assessment objectives and think to what degree we feel they're meeting some of them. Are we seeing flashes, in which case we might be at the lower end of a level? Are we seeing it consistently, in which case we want to be quite secure? So we're looking at that response, taking a few moments with it, and then when you're happy, if you want to just pop the level that you suggest, and then it doesn't need to be a sort of detailed commentary, but just maybe a few phrases or comments on what made you feel it was at the level that you've chosen. And by all means, if you want to suggest an actual mark, you know, you can do so also. So it's a marking activity. If you've not had or not received the packs, if you go back to the link that Claire put in at the beginning of the chat, that should take you through to the delegate pack. And it's from script A, and it's the section A question on taming of the shrew. And if we allow 5 minutes for that, so we'll start to gather thoughts at minute 51. And things we can look for as we're choosing a level. We can think about the exemplification and to what degree it may evaluate the features and how we might judge the use of those terms or the structure and expression at AO1. We're thinking also then about how the candidate has considered the way that the meanings are shaped in the text. Is there, how would we term the understanding of crafting? Are we deciding it is clear? Is it discriminating? Is it sophisticated? We're thinking also about the treatment or how the candidate balances or deals with contextual factors, the sense of whether they work through those alternative interpretations or sense of nuance, and then the sense of, are they using that outside material, the context, the critical interpretation, to sort of illuminate or reinforce or tease out their own critical response. I appreciate it. You've had quite a rapid skim through the response. But if you'd like to start just suggesting a level and broadly, the features that maybe suggested that level to you for this candidate. So we're thinking about the presentation of their arguments, the level of analysis and evaluation, the use that's been made of context, sense of critical interpretation, and again, sort of use being made of it. Okay, so we've got the sense that you've suggested that they do touch on these, but maybe not feeling that depth of evaluation, so suggesting probably level 4. If we can have then responses, if we can have a few more responses in the chat, and then we'll reveal the final mark that the essay was awarded. Thank you, Elena. So if we're thinking certainly in the top half of the mark scheme, if we're thinking we're certainly beyond clear and relevant, we start to consider, is the candidate being discriminating in their choices? Maybe they're possibly a little bit inconsistent. Maybe we think they are stronger on one objective than another. Maybe are we seeing flashes in a particular area? So I'd encourage you not to be shy. Don't worry, it's not a test. So if we're saying somehow is fine, where then would we possibly put it? If you're thinking it's achieving at sort of a reasonable level across the objectives, if you had to kind of put a level on it? Are we thinking 3, 4, or 5? I think, from our first responses there, we're already assuming that we're not dealing with a general answer or a descriptive or straightforward answer. So we're thinking about where might this answer be placed. Okay, so we've got 2 now for level 4. So some are sort of suggesting lower 4. And Jade, if I could I'll not make you write an essay on it. The idea, if you're suggesting it's an insecure 4, was there a particular assessment objective that you felt was maybe not as strong as the others? Elena's come in suggesting that we'd like to maybe see more context. The idea of how to be evaluative, yes, it's the level to which they work with the example they've given, I suppose. So if they have taken an example of a motif or symbolism, it's an evaluation potentially of where that might fit in terms of the idea of contrasting appearance and reality. It might be that they link it across in an evaluative fashion. So they make a link to context, but in a way to explain how they believe audiences are responding or how they believe the author intended. Jay, thank you. You've said that there's a lot covered, but you feel it lacks the consistent depth. So we're having a message here that it's maybe not fully consistent. It doesn't have the depth and control that we'd be looking for. Any further takers? So thank you, everyone who's contributed so far. Any other comments that anyone would like to add? So if we go with what we do have so far, we've got a suggestion that we're seeing qualities of level 4, not always consistently. And then we had sort of a comment when we have a comment, if we're saying something's fine, we do need to maybe go to that marking grid and think about, if you're saying it's fine, is it sort of fine in terms of what you're expecting, and where would you put that? Where would you sort of place that in the mark grid? We'll have a look, and you might be surprised to an extent if we find that certainly, I think those who are suggesting level 4, you're certainly on the right path, because it does sort of have enough to meet that quality of discrimination. I see where people are saying, they feel sometimes context is not always explicit, and that maybe is a potential weakness, but in balance alongside other aspects of the candidate's response, it was actually considered to be strong. It got just into level 5, but just to sort of say this idea that this is a good example of a flashes of answer. This idea of what we say, catch them being good. Certainly anyone who felt like level 4 in many places, that you're not wrong. It's sort of a candidate. Certainly, I think they're doing more than being clear and relevant. There is a degree of control in how they're trying to present their information. They are demonstrating a degree of discrimination and some flashes of nuance in their selected discussion. We've got the level 5 criteria here. We've all agreed, or we felt that, they certainly were not sort of achieving this consistently, but it was felt there were the odd flashes, the odd moments that would allow it and enable it to say that it had met the criteria for level 4, and enough sparks, if we like, enough caught being good to take it that 1 mark into 5. So we did say, didn't we? We said that it may not necessarily be sustained, but there were flashes of sophistication. There were moments where the candidate was moving just a little bit beyond control. The sense that there was an awareness how meaning is shaped. And the understanding of writer's craft, I would agree, it sort of veered between controlled, maybe not quite sort of consistently sophisticated, but there is a sense that there is a grasp of craft. Context is always a tricky one, because when we're teaching it and we're trying to sort of guide students and encourage them to look at a variety of contexts and information from different sources, under time conditions, they're not always going to get that into the response. And in fact, we're looking to award candidates where they bring in a sort of less is more approach, where they are bringing in elements of context or an implicit awareness of the wider context and the wider world and the wider features of production and reception in which the text has been created. So our context in an exam, it can occasionally look a little bit light touch, and certainly it's an area that we want to encourage candidates to gain a bit more confidence in. But equally in marking, if that ends up being that slightly weaker part of the response, it may bring it down, but maybe not enough to sort of take it right beyond the level. It certainly wouldn't have taken it lower than 4. And in fact, it didn't even stop it getting that 1 mark into level 5. And again, it's what we mean by sustained. Candidates have a lot to do in the time that we've given them. And there was enough here to suggest this candidate was moving towards what we would consider sustained in a timed response, and a sense of an own position arriving. I know you've been very patient and you've been listening for quite a long time now. What I will suggest is we will take a very brief wellbeing break to allow people to step away and possibly get themselves a quick refreshment. If we can say, it is quite a brief break, if we could say that we can regroup in possibly 7-8 minutes time, so just before 10 past. It would be nice to sort of catch up with everyone then. So I'll give you an opportunity to step away, take a comfort break, get yourself a quick refreshment. We can start sort of looking at the next part, the next section, and we'll aim to be get going full tilt at 10 past the hour. So I will speak to everyone and sort of catch up with everyone then. So do take that moment, and I will catch up with you and hear from you soon. Okay, welcome back, and hopefully everyone's had a chance to take a brief step away. We're working now on section B, the pre-1900 poetry. And we can see here our key assessment objectives for this part of the paper. We've got our AO1, which is the sense of that informed response. AO2, we're always looking at the writer's craft and how meaning is shaped. AO3, we're thinking about context, and then AO5, our sense of those different interpretations coming to the fore. And we're hoping as well that candidates should be able to build upon work done in the prior units and work done across the course. And we're looking at what we would expect for poetic method, elements of form and structure, elements of language choice, image, symbol, motif, rhyme and rhythm, the theme, the tone and mood, and the sense of the voice or the perspective that's being taken. Here that we have the sense of the knowledge and understanding of the function of the key features. So with these being sort of open book and poems that candidates are familiar with, we're thinking about those features and how they function in the particular text. The sense of how we can read that poem. So sense of reading for detail, looking at formal and structural elements, and then other critical and creative responses. We're looking for fluent communication and the sense of critical evaluation of the poetry and linking those assessment objectives where we can. The sense of the attitude and value being expressed, and this one can be linked through to both the sense of voice and also context, and possibly there bringing in our critical interpretations. Trying to use these concepts with discrimination. And thinking about the conventions of writing when referring to other texts and sources. We have a series of anthologies that are being used. So for some candidates, it will be work with metaphysical poetry. Others will be examining English Romantic verse, and others will be working with Victorian verse. As in previous sections on prior exams, we have a choice of 2 questions per selection, and candidates will choose one. The Romantics do still seem to be sort of quite a popular choice, followed by metaphysicals and Victorians. So we have a series of tasks, and we'll look at some tasks and remind ourselves of the format and the structure. So candidates will be referred to a named poem. They will be asked to discuss an element of theme, motif, or a technical aspect, and they will discuss it using the named poem plus a poem of their choice from the set list. And it does remind students that when they're discussing the poems, they should consider relevant contextual factors. So if we look at Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, the question or the focus is the sense of timelessness. And we can see that the question remains explore the ways in which, followed by the prompt. And we are always reminded, as we said, to consider relevant contextual factors. So there is the sense of timelessness potentially being interpreted as sort of immortality. We have the sense that some candidates may set a particular challenge and consider it in terms of a representation of history or a moment caught in time. And there are sort of a variety of ways in which candidates could approach the task. Often we think about also the suitability of the paired poem. So it can be something to discuss with candidates, because often where we see limitations, it's when they've maybe not carefully considered their chosen poem, and they're maybe struggling or finding it a challenge to explore or make a contrasting point or even sort of make a suggestion about how the theme is presented in that poem. They've maybe chosen one that they're feeling confident with, but finding it hard to fit it in with the particular question. Question 12 option is on The Question by Shelley. And this one, again, we can see it's a sort of key central romantic theme, power of the imagination. So this one possibly gives us a degree of freedom in terms of the choice of a second poem. You know, we're thinking about it's not just purely imagination, but that idea of the power of the imagination. We might be bringing in elements such as the sublime, for example. And we think of that depending on how a candidate uses those types of aspects. occasionally we might find that the way the candidate is using, say, for example, the concept of sublime, it may be awarded as a sense of AO3 context in terms of genre and movement. But equally, it can occasionally be awarded as AO5 critical interpretation if they're using it as a way into sort of understanding the crafting or the language focus. The sense of encouraging the discussion, as we've had with all of the other types of questions across genre. Our wording won't change. The idea of explore will stay the same. The idea of reminding students to select another poem from the list, and the reminder to deal with context. The thing that will change, as we said, is our steer, our topic, our focus. We do think about context and making connections. So although we're saying it's not sort of comparative as such, the sense that we're finding a theme or a shared aspect or even a topic being dealt with in differing or contrasting ways. So it's not that they're being directly required to sort of compare contrast, because that's not it, but it is the sense that there will be an aspect of, if we can integrate and connect discussion, candidates will have a chance to sort of explore that nuance. Thinking about questions that people would choose and how they may deal with the sense of this phrase timelessness. So obviously this has sense for Ode for Grecian, but if we think about a concept such as timelessness, how could we get students to focus on sort of an abstract concept in their opening section? So in terms of structure, any advice as to what they should adopt or what they should avoid, and how could they show that they're focusing on this phrase timelessness, or timlessness, as the slide is currently saying, but yes, timelessness. So if we were giving some first advice to the students, and we have timelessness, which would suit this particular poem, but if we think about this idea of how we would discuss a concept, any primary advice we'd give for approaches to adopt or avoid as they begin to plan or begin to craft the opening of their response. And even if you're not necessarily working on the romantics, we could see a way in which a similar question may occur for our metaphysicals or our Victorians. So if we're thinking of a question where they're presented with a concept, advice for opening the response. I mean, if you are studying romantics, for example, would there be a poem that you feel would be a natural partner to Ode on a Grecian Urn? Likewise, if you are studying metaphysicals or Victorians, if you could consider time or timelessness and any poems springing to mind. How would you advise them to begin? Do you advise your candidates to sort of set a definition or a hook or a frame for the term of the question? Do you suggest they get straight in and focus on the characteristics quite common to the particular writer? So what advice could you give? And again, if anyone wants to briefly share or pop their thoughts in the chat box. So we're saying timelessness, but it could be so this idea of an abstract concept being the steer of a question. And how do we advise candidates to proceed? Do we suggest they need to be pertinent in terms of how a particular poet deals within their work? Do we define the term? Do we ask the candidate to sort of define what it means to them? Do we make an immediate comparison, contrast, if we've chosen a poem with a very different approach? In terms of how they open, what would you advise? Okay, so we have the sense of this idea, and again, the sense of multiple angle, multiple perspective. Go for the obvious as the second one and not to overthink. That's very good advice, actually. We can get a little bit tangled in knots if we spend too long sort of trying to sort of come up with unusual or sort of esoteric pairings. Any other advice that anyone would give when they get, the question that's kind of concept based? Any what not to do advice? So we definitely have a not to overthink. Any advice on what you tell them to avoid at all costs? Or sort of. And again, this might vary by candidate, in terms of um, pairing poems in a way that will work for them. So if we pick up on Elena's point, the sense of make sure that there may be an obvious pairing there, so do go for it. There's also a question occasionally of length and the demands of each poem. Occasionally, a candidate will select, if there are two quite lengthy, quite sophisticated poems, it may be hard to cover what they want to cover in the time available. So there's a consideration of management as well in terms of managing those pairings. There's a lot for the students to do, isn't there? There's quite a lot that they have to bear in mind. There's quite a lot they have to think about in terms of their exam techniques. That question in itself does seem to be a bit of a gift if we choose the right paired poem, if we don't sort of pair it with something that's too difficult to work with. And certainly, should they make a plan, yes, please, definitely a plan. Yes, Jed, you're reiterating this idea, don't try something. It's wonderful when we try something new, but maybe the day of the exam is not the day to do that, is it? It's the safe and confident that stands out. Yes, if they're confident making that sort of ranging and moving quite comfortably between the poems, then, that shines through, doesn't it? And then that leaves them the room to actually work in context and critical stance in effective ways, because they're not worrying about sort of tackling sort of a brand new text or an unfamiliar text. So definitely, I think with this is it, isn't it? It's sort of exam strategies often, because there's quite a lot else to do. So we don't have sort of one particular specified method, apart from the idea of, as we said, avoid the narration, make sure we are not just retelling the content of the poem. The sense of the paragraph and form and structure, because they often forget. Again, very good advice. Yes, I would second that. I think that sometimes poor form and structure, if it gets left too late, it's sort of tagged on at the end. But if we begin with the idea that, yes, we are looking at some poems and that certain poems have a particular structure for certain reasons, we are getting in there, aren't we? And we're thinking about, the idea of poetic method right from the start, right from the opening. Just where I've sort of paused there, I'm not actually sort of advising those earlier structural methods. We have seen these types of acronyms at GCSE. They do have a place with candidates who really lack confidence and who need a level of structure to get going. But hopefully by the time we reach the exams, they've developed a sort of style and an approach of their own. We find those who stick quite rigidly to ticking off method, they end up, not sort of being able to handle that movement between more than one poem. So we're saying we're not actively discouraging it, but it can occasionally limit a student at a certain point. It's a great scaffold, but it's maybe something to take away, as they get closer to the test. The other choice of poem we did say is critical, and everyone's sort of giving that good advice. If something seems obvious, there's a reason, because it makes a nice pairing. We thankfully don't have so much of this anymore. We did occasionally in the early settings of the paper have candidates who maybe possibly panicked and just worked with the poem they knew, or covered only one poem. What we do occasionally see is if the candidate hasn't quite been given the poem they want, they sometimes will quite heavily weight towards one that they've prepared. And It's not an issue in itself. We're not expecting exactly 50-50, but we would stress that we do need to see that reasonable coverage and that effective coverage of the set poem. So that's something we see more often than just a single poem being covered. We'll see if the candidate is not wholly confident with the choices that have come up in the question. They may give a fleeting discussion of the set poem, and then we obviously then get a poem that they're much more in tune with. But we would just suggest that they do have to make sure that set poem does have, the level of coverage that would be expected. And again, it's not quite a rubric infringement, but it would heavily affect them if they gave a sort of light touch to the poem that's named in the question. And that links into a similar problem that we sometimes get. Candidates do have favourites and they do have poems that they are confident on, but occasionally they will proceed with a poem regardless of the terms of the task. So you'll see them choosing a poem that's maybe deeply unsuitable to the key terms of the question, and then they're really struggling to sort of manhandle it into shape. And as we've said earlier, you've mentioned if there's an obvious pairing, they should do it. There is this idea that they sort of make a difficulty for themselves. The sense of opening and closing lines, if we can have a position from the beginning and not sort of simply the restate of the word, but the sense that, that they sort of come out with confidence with a view about the particular question that's being asked. And then, as you've mentioned, you talked about beginning maybe possibly with formal structures. That's a good way of showing early in the response that you're thinking about how it's being presented. And that is good advice, isn't it? We want to make sure that we're working with method and we're thinking about method as a way of conveying the theme that a particular question is asking about. Whereas if we do get too tied down in trying to just deal with the concept, there's danger, there's digression away from the texts. It's good to keep referring back to the terms. So it is good to keep those signposts and markers as you work your way through. We did say this, similarly for Shakespeare, we want sort of more than that word level analysis, so certainly we want aspects of formal and wider structures, looking at patterns and motifs, looking at the sense of working things through. Approaches that you may advise to avoid. The linear model does come with problems for some students. If they take a linear approach, they can occasionally lapse into a narrative if they take sort of chronological order through, and it may be more difficult to prove sophistication. It's not to say that it's always sort of forbidden, but it does tend to lead, particularly mid-range candidates, into that sort of miry swamp. So encourage them to take, as we say, maybe a feature-led approach, as some of you have already said in the comments, the idea of leading with method and then using that to explore or illuminate the theme. Thinking about those choices as separate sections. So again, you've come at this already, the idea that if we come at it through method and crafting, we're exploring the theme from a variety of angles. Yes, we should make a plan. It could be useful. It doesn't really matter the form it takes. The plan is not sort of part of the assessed or marked work, but it's whatever works for the student. Some students find it's quite helpful to make a bullet list that roughly tallies with their paragraphs or sections. Some find it's helpful to make that mind map, which potentially suggests connections. We're not saying that it's marked as comparison, but the idea if they can connect ideas in their head about the poems, they're able to maybe explore context in a more pertinent way. The sense of romanticism, as we said, still being the front runner. We've got this question on power of the imagination from the poem, the question, and the sense of what does that steer mean? So sometimes when we have these slightly longer phrases, we maybe need to define these, to our reader, to our examiner. So the sense of what might it look like, and that would be beneficial before we get into the analysis of the method in this instance. We might think that if we were doing this as a retrospect, and we mentioned with Shakespeare, when we're preparing with students, making use of the mark schemes and those documents alongside the past papers to actually help candidates with planning approaches. So the sense of the linkage between poems. So it's that tricky thing, isn't it? It's not AO4, but we are saying that a good, effective, integrated answer, it's going to make a good pairing. It's going to choose two texts that work maybe in different ways to bring out the theme or the topic, but they're allowing candidates to make useful observations. And it could be that they're tackling a theme through very different formal considerations. It could be that actually they're quite similar. It could be even that they're staying with one writer and they're thinking about characteristics of their work and generic elements, and so there's many ways they can do it. So it's not that, as we said, it's explicitly being checked as AO4, but it's the idea that to do really effective AO3, AO5, it's worth considering the strength of the second poem chosen and how it can help the candidate make smooth transitions in their arguments. So appropriate choices. Suggestion here, question may go with Ode to a Nightingale. Things that candidates may wish to cover. So they may wish to make a sort of series of words that have collocation with the sense of power of the imagination. Words like dream, visionary. They might look at how particular imagery is relating to vision. So we've got sort of our quotes sort of singled out there. The idea that the romantic proposal, the question, and the sense of both the speculation as imagination and then how that's presented through the writer's techniques. And then also readings of this. Poem is escape, written in response, loss of children, so the idea of the context, giving it sort of that different meaning, giving it that nuance. And then this point we made about making that contextual critical link. So the role of imagination in sort of the romantic movement, romantic poetry, and the sense of how that could be demonstrated or linked into the poem. So the sense of the civilization relying upon it, and then how we can see that in the question. They could have responses of one poet to another. So we recommend, Browning on Shelley, might be appropriate. What can we do with AO3 and what do we include in AO3? In these particular cases, the writer's life and individual situation can be relevant, but we would keep it very focused upon how a particular element relates to the text. So we don't want sort of a sweeping biographical overview, but it may be pertinent, and I'm thinking about metaphysical poetry in particular, I'm thinking about some of the works of John Donne. It may be pertinent to look at a particular moment in time or a particular aspect of the writer's history and how that is related or illuminated in the text. We've got the broader sense of historical setting for the movements. And again, the social and cultural context, working with these themed anthologies, we should be able to make those connections across both choices. The sense also of reception, possibly. We'll ignore the staging, which is to do with plays, but the idea of review. We gave an example there of poets on fellow poets, how the piece was taken at the time and how we take it today or at other times. Ways that we can deal with context. It can be our direct input. It can be sending candidates to do some individual work with audio-visual, look at some introductory videos, for example. It can be sending candidates to do some research and present back to peers. It can be the idea of taking things like sort of factual information or short academic tasks and then turning them into even more concise revision aids, turning something into a quiz or a flashcard or role play. And things that can be used, at our higher level, if we're looking at those key critical responses to individual poems, we may be looking at sources such as Google Scholar and JSTOR. You may be subscribing to eMagazine, which sort of brings things to sort of students' age appropriate level, or the English Review. There are obviously our individual books on our individual poets. Occasionally, there can be film and TV links to some of the lives of the poets. We have this suggestion now that the sense of AI and the role it might play, and we'll come to that later, if it is being used in class or college, how can it be used in ways that help and don't harm? But what we do say, whichever way we get our context, is we're avoiding the chunk or the chunk, so we're trying not to sort of use context unless it is, as we said, that word pertinent and discriminating. So we're looking for less, but more focused. So we're looking for context being used in very specific ways. So if you are talking about, for example, the question, we don't sort of want sort of a chunk on Shelley. We want the sense of maybe a very pertinent comment on a view of imagination, which we can see evidence for in the poem. For level 5, it's the sense of significance and influence. So we always remember the second half of that bullet. So we're not just demonstrating that we have that knowledge, but we can actually use it to consider how influential it is in interpreting the text. AI, we will go through quickly. I know different schools will have different approaches, but the sense of, if candidates are making use of it, to what sense do we actually incorporate it into a text? So we could take, for example, this question from Metaphysical on John Donne's Go and Catch a Falling Star, and thinking about how you might encourage a candidate to independently use AI in useful ways that are not just taking away critical thinking. You might ask them to become the teacher. So you might ask them to think about how they would tighten a search term or a planning term to get a viable response, not to use or to parrot that response, but to actually critique the issues that we have with AI, whilst also finding that it maybe does give some reasonable structural guidance. So they may sort of look at what might happen if they use words like mood and tone and how they might improve it. So they might sort of make certain comparisons, and then this again would be part of individual practice. They could actually suggest a comparison and see what happens if they ask for a 750-word response. If the candidate then has to input or suggest about history, biographical and social contexts, and then the sense of how each writer may present a view. We may then ask the candidate to put in their own quotations. And the idea would be that they're noticing that this will only ever be as good as what they put in, and it's certainly not something that they use to then just regurgitate or churn out. It can be a useful tool, but it's only ever sort of as good as inputs, and it should be there as a support, not as sort of a replacement for their own learning or sort of a replacement for their own thoughts. And as we said, here are other ways we might do this, thinking about critiquing the style of what's sort of generated, and hopefully it will make them recognize that actually their own individual voice is paramount. And we've got in underlining there, let's remind them that some of these particular resources are notorious for making things up, and that in itself should hopefully be a teaching moment. One thing that we do want to look at is that the AO5 can be something that candidates are quite wary about, although we have noticed improvements in recent series. It could be that it needs to be linked more directly to task rather than maybe reminding an examiner of what they've read. The sense of exemplification of it. So it could be moving away from just naming something as a school-based theory, this is Marxist or this is this, trying to avoid the steer a critic says, maybe replace that with one interpretation suggests that, so it's actually maybe better to frame it as an interpretation, and that should encourage them to present their own interpretation in relation to it. So we have here an opening, a short section, that among the most quintessential ideas that inspired Romantic poetry is the idea that it can serve as a vehicle for renewal. More specifically, that the contemplation undertaken in a stimulating environment is capable of yielding. And this is the beginning of a text in script B, section B. And we're going to just have a look at this one. And we're going to think about where this one might go. And what I will do, I think, with this one, I will temporarily stop my share and we'll share this one together. So thinking about what we've mentioned, we've talked about the idea of how we use context and what context might look like in a good response. It's got to be pertinent. So the idea that less is more and that it's integrated. It would be better to see small elements of context and critical interpretation coming throughout an essay and being an integral part of a candidate's argument when they've discussed language and poetic method. So we'll look at this one together this time, and then we'll sort of suggest where we think it is, where we think it goes. If you just bear with me, I will stop my share screen for a moment and I will bring up script B. Okay, so you just give it one moment. Hopefully we will be seeing script B on screen. If you can just put a little Y for yes in the chat box, just to indicate that you can now see the beginning of a script reading 2406, section B, Q11. Just a quick check with everybody. Yes, that's looking like we're all on board. Okay, so this is the question about timelessness. For some reason, this was a student with a typed response, and it did sort of chop them off quite strangely on page 1, but not to fear, we have more essay to come. So this is their opening. They begin with a hook, if we like. A quintessential idea that inspired romantic poetry is the idea could serve as a vehicle for renewal. More specifically, that contemplation is contained, undertaken in a stimulating environment, preferably a natural one, capable of yielding such insight as to reinvigorate and re-inspire human beings in a world of despair. The above lines might be considered a summary not only of Wordsworth's lines in Early Spring, but Keats's sonnet on the sea. Both poems embody a broadly similar approach to ideas of renewal, locating them in terms of power of renewal that nature can confer. In both, the poets approach a natural setting, wearied by the miseries of human condition. In both, the beauty of nature, or at least our perception, is presented as enabling renewal through the use of senses. Though renewal is not presented as being perfect in Wordsworth's poem, it's nevertheless presented as a possibility. And the two poets do make use of structural and oral revises to similar ends, constructing ideas of renewal. And what they've done here, actually, they've not actually sort of worked with timeless, they've worked with renewal, and they're looking at Keats and Wordsworth. And in terms of the candidates A01, we've certainly got someone who has begun in a controlled way. They have suggested that they're going to be looking at both poems, and they are giving us their terms. They're giving us their understanding of what they believe renewal means as a concept, and they are suggesting an overview. Though renewal is not presented as being perfect in Wordsworth's poem, it's nevertheless presented as a possibility. So they're stating a critical view that they're going to go on and explore and evaluate. The two poets do make use of structural and oral devices to similar ends. So again, this nod to structure, showing that they understand that that is an aspect of poetic method. They then begin the argument in earnest. The premise upon which both poets arguably begin exploration of ideas of renewal is the weariness of both poets with the excess of society. In Wordsworth's poem, he asked, "Have I not reason to lament what man hath made of man?" In Keats's poem, he addresses those whose ears are dinned with uproar rude, and whose eyeballs are vexed and tired, asking them to immerse themselves in the wideness of the sea. In both, the idea conveyed that the two poets arrive at present state seeking renewal because of the misery society evokes in them, and this articulates a concern universal to all romantics, the disenchantment of human condition variously leading to them either seeking solitude to contemplate or actively engaging with and challenging it. And it must be noted that Keats took Wordsworth as a role model in composing early poetry, and as such it might be argued that any resemblances between two poets are a conscious imitation of the latter's style of the former. So what they have done here, they have sort of given a sense of what they believe Wordsworth's argument to be, and then they are making a connection of the sense of they believe there's a shared understanding of trying to seek and arrive at renewal and having a misery with urban society. There is a sort of contextual element in two aspects. We have both an understanding of a general romantic feeling, that disenchantment with human condition, and then we also have a contextual point of Keats taking Wordsworth as a role model. So there is sort of AO3 with Keats and Wordsworth, and then the AO3 possibly crossing to AO5 in terms of if they had sort of backed that up with some reference to those texts, but the sense that there is an understanding that AO3 that romantics do have particular shared concerns. It then continues with the view of renewal, the power of nature to inspire contemplation. In Wordsworth, he established himself as in a grove estate reclined, noting nature is capable of putting one in a sweet mood of pleasant thoughts, sad thoughts to the mind, suggesting it carries power to inspire and provoke reflection necessary to induce renewal. In Keats, despite the less personal tone, Keats preferring to use direct address as opposed to a lyrical or confessional manner, his exhortation to sit by the cavern's mouth and brood strikes at exactly the same pursuit as Wordsworth, namely the idea renewal can be achieved by taking place in solitude and midst of natural beauty, allowing one to brood and process thoughts in tranquility. This may be explained with reference to Wordsworth's idea of poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility, and it explains the retrospective tone, the use of the past tense in words like heard and sit creates. In both poems, the use of the senses takes nature's details and arguably similarly presented as crucial. Wordsworth, for instance, evokes sensory imagery through noting having heard 1,000 blended notes, evolving the sensation of a breezy air, and describing in intricate detail the visual sight of birds that hopped and played. In a similar manner, Keats also appeals to multiple senses, evoking not only the wildness of the sea, but eternal whisperings that one hears when situated next to it. The creation of descriptive imagery, from Wordsworth's intricate evocation of the scene in the third stanza of the periwinkle that trailed the wreath, through the green bower, to Keats' juxtaposition of the mighty swell and the smallest shell, the rhyme adding emphasis to the scale and grandeur, it's arguably presented in both poems as crucial to the experience of renewal. Again, this may be explained with reference to Wordsworth's emphasis on the importance of visual faculties for recollection of emotion. His poet emphasising the way in which a speaker imprints beauty of surroundings in the reader's mind, in order to later digest and extract pleasure and renewal. This is arguably echoed exactly in Keats's poem, in how both the narrators are largely supine. The majority of the poem focuses simply on taking on features and beauty of the natural scene surrounding narrators, rather than feelings of the narrators themselves. So we have there an element of sort of dealing with language, imagery, and perspective. And while it sort of uses some overview, what we are getting there is kind of an integrated approach, and the idea that the candidate is being quite cogent in bringing together their assessment objectives and bringing in this sense of what the poets are up to. The two poems are similar in presentation of sublimity of nature as a key property, conducive to renewing effort exerts on them. In Wordsworth's poem, it's articulated through the way he presents all nature linked in harmonious existence, noting conviction, every flower enjoys air it breathes. The least motion birds made carried a thrill of pleasure, extending to the periwinkle with the use of the verb trailed, evoking ideas of languorous serenity. In personification of nature, the capital letter highlights it. Wordsworth arguably presents himself as drawing comfort from a sense of order and higher consciousness perceived in nature surrounding him. From personification of how flowers enjoy the air, to the way the periwinkle consciously trailed his wreaths, and how the budding twigs attempt to catch the breezy air, noting the belief might be from heaven sent, and pleasure is nature's holy plan. Wordsworth arguably presents himself as drawing renewal from transcendence of natural beauty inspires in him, an ability to immerse himself in the higher truths of pleasure and bliss that order and organisation convey, total surrender to it, allowing nature to link a human soul that through me ran in a sense of joy. In this manner, Wordsworth almost articulates a Kantian spiritual, pantheist and Spinoza-esque idea of sublime, representative of a conscious power that reminds him of the oneness of creation. Keats arguably articulates similar ideas in the power to renew sublimity of nature, but in a much less philosophical and purely descriptive manner. Like Wordsworth's deification of nature, Keats arguably devotes attention to the ancient power of the sea to keep eternal whisperings round, reference to Hecate in old caverns, creating an idea of a timeless and transcendent force, capitalising it exactly the same way Wordsworth does nature, with the same effect of indicating beauty partly stemming from perception of a higher consciousness. However, while Wordsworth adheres to a softer version of sublime, presenting it arising from a harmonious unity in natural phenomena surrounding him, Keats arguably focuses on a more Burkean concept of sublime, the use of plosive alliteration and hyperbole combining to add an undertone of power to the description. And speaking of winds of heaven being unbound, Keats again creates the idea of the sea as harsh and nature possessing a tremendous power emanating directly from heaven to be bound to prevent it exerting full force. Indeed, it's worth pointing a small similarity between the poem's use of hyperbole, existing in both the word thousand to emphasize power and multiplicity of nature. However, while Wordsworth arguably renews himself through the belief in nature's divinity and unity that the sublime inspires, Keats's renewal is presented as far less spiritual, stemming from awe at the duality and unpredictability of the sea, capacity for the mighty swell and wideness to glut 10,000 caverns, yet also assume a gentle temper that scarcely with the smallest shell should be moved. And what we're hopefully seeing here, as we're now on the third or the 3.5 pages, we are certainly sustaining, and we certainly have a level of understanding that is controlled. We would ask ourselves, are we discriminating, or are we more than that? Are we sophisticated? It then moves on to discuss or compare and think of a difference of worldview. So we have this idea of this AO3, but then also when we discuss negative capability, if it's being used to talk about poetic method, it becomes AO5, it becomes an element of critical interpretation. It then draws attention to subtle differences with Keats and the idea of affirmative vocabulary, moving through to dilemma and the difference in the romantic approach, and then moving on, as we say, to look more formally at structural devices and oral devices and carrying through. And if we just take a look at the close, and then I'll give everyone just a moment, it's a long one, but I'll give you a moment to skim read again and decide on level or possibly mark. We have then our ending. What seems to emerge of the two poems is they bear striking similarities in myriad ways. Both represent typical articulations of M.H. Auden's view. Romantic poetry is distinguished by use of nature as a lamp to illuminate a critical reflection that leads to renewal. In Keats's words, to act as a muse, as if the sea nymphs choired, and spurn renewed creative energy and faith in humanity. Both present renewal as necessary due to miseries of human condition. Both presented occurring via immersion in nature. Both also presented as occurring specifically because of sublimity in nature, even if the two derive different meaning from this, reflecting different worldviews. Thus, in similarities and differences, the two make for illuminating comparison. Okay, so just while I renew and restore the PowerPoint presentation, if you go to your script B, it's a long one, but if you take another skim back through it, and as we've done before, if you can, in the chat box, suggest a level or maybe even potentially a mark, and just a short comment beside it, giving a reason for the level you've chosen. I suppose what we're asking here, we're aware that we are now, we think, beyond certainly descriptive, straightforward. Certainly, we think we're doing a little bit, certainly more than relevant. So I suppose what we're asking is we're looking at thinking about characteristics of 4, characteristics of 5. Are we saying that the work is controlled and discriminating? Are we saying that actually we are now at a level of critical evaluation? So if you could just post your thoughts. And what we're asking is 4 or 5. And if we're thinking 5, how far would we go? Thank you. So we have a full mark, sophisticated, maintains the style. Due to the fact comparison is not awarded, I've told them not to compare to save time. And this is it. The comparison, this is the tricky thing. It's not awarded as AO4, but we can see with this candidate, can't we, that the way that they sort of deal with them together, it's actually helped them with their AO3 and AO5 in talking about, Keats's relationship or the degree to which he was influenced by Wordsworth. It helps them get to where they're going. So it's a good example of where it's tricky, isn't it? We're not explicitly saying you must compare, but in this particular instance, the candidate has used that vehicle to actually really prove some pertinent AO3, AO5. So we have a full marks, and then if we could just see if others would like to comment, are we in agreement, or any other views? And then we shall reveal it in a moment. And we're not trying to trick anyone. We're thinking hopefully that we are in level 5, and if we have sort of no further or no more takers, Elena, you are absolutely correct in what you sort of believed, that potentially if we had any criticism, we might say to the candidate, be more concise. But we're not there to criticize. We're not there to say what we might have done differently. We are looking to see, have they met the criteria? And this is actually a very impressive 25 of 25. They have done a lot in this answer. This is a typed answer. If we think back in terms of how far this would be if it was handwritten, they are covering a lot of ground. We might argue that potentially they begin at the degree of overview, and that does sometimes happen with answers that eventually take themselves to full marks. But once they get going, they are working with pertinent apt references. The argument is sustained throughout. We can see in the conclusion that they're pulling and drawing their thoughts back together quite effectively. There is the sense that it's a consistency of sophistication. It's beyond a 25 in many respects in terms of what we expect a student to do in the timed response. And we do say there is a slight danger, isn't there? If we presented this to our candidates without any sort of introduction, it's an intimidation. We are not saying that you need to write this much or produce this level of detail to gain full marks. But this candidate did sort of make use of a good choice of poems/poets. They chose texts where they felt there was definitely a relationship, and that meant that it lent to some quite natural discussion of views in terms of the Romantic poets, the Romantic movements, and they were clearly sort of deeply engaged with this. They had a lot to say. So as we wrap up and think about the ways that candidates come to texts, we're hoping that the candidates are moving beyond one, and we sort of describe one as a sort of a visit to the text. They can sort of think about it, identify something quite simply, and occasionally there will be accuracy, even at level 1, but it's quite variable. There might be errors, there might be mistakes. At level 2, there's a degree of reviewing coming up. Candidates may be able to spot or speak of some features, but their viewpoints or their comments are often slightly unconnected and often just lose a focus on the task. Level 3 is where we start to see secure work. Candidates can identify and explain. Sometimes it can be in quite a linear fashion, and sometimes context connections aren't wholly secure. But with a level 3, we're talking about a candidate who has a clear grasp of a task and they know what's being asked of them, and they're producing, quite effective information to support their viewpoint. Level 4 is where we start to explore. Candidates already know what they're looking for. They're being slightly discriminating in terms of what they're choosing or what they're including from the text. And there's a clear sense throughout that how each particular example or each perspective connects to a form of context or critical approach. So everything they do is sort of worth rewarding. Everything they're doing, it can be still a little bit inconsistent, as we saw with that example that just got to level 5 in section A. It was mainly a level 4 response with sort of flashes of 5. But it's the sense that what they're doing is rewarding. The work they've got is worthy of reward. And they are looking closely and can move beyond just the lexis and phonology of poems. And there's some attempt at evaluating authorial purpose. Level 5 then we could describe as scrutiny. And that idea that we said about overview, we may have felt that the candidate in script B maybe began with that wider view, but it showed that they really were engaging with the entire Romantic movement. And they did actually then go on to pursue the work in that more minute detail. So there was actually quite a nice balance between the sort of zoom out and zoom in. So they definitely convinced us within a short period of time that it wasn't just sort of a general discussion. It was moving quite pertinently towards discussion of renewal. They were very secure in what they were doing, and we can see that in their signposting and how they concluded their answer. They evaluated concepts and they were sustained and mostly nuanced. We're not saying we need nuance 100% of the time, but very much the majority of that response was nuanced. We've mentioned there are ways of approaching course. We can either be linear or modular. And that sort of can even change in terms of cohorts or different groups in terms of what we feel suit the students and the demands it makes upon them. We have the sense that the AOs will be approached in slightly different ways in section A and section B. We've had some very helpful sharing of tips and hints. So thank you for those of you who've made those contributions. I know it can be quite daunting when we're talking into the void. So thank you very much for continuing to make the comments. The sense then of where can we go for support. We have the IAL English Literature page. I did mention at the beginning of the session that there is a degree of overlap with both texts and skills bases with the so-called home qualification on the UK page as well. So sometimes you will find additional resources. We had the example with previous work on Othello where there is some nice critical and contextual information on the home course in the booklet, which kind of makes life a bit easier for people if they're trying to prepare students to do some independent work on AO3 and AO5. So do sort of work across both. Clearly we've got resources for teaching and learning and exam and assessment past papers on this part of the site, but it is also worth sort of having a look across at the sister qualification for GCE English Literature, and there will be some additional resources there that can be of use to you. We've got, as we said, the different areas of the website to explore. Often past training, there will be links to it. So if there's a session that you've missed, there's usually a recording that can be found somewhere. If it requires additional resources, you can always make contact with Edexcel, and they should hopefully be able to furnish you with the resources you need to look at the recording. Results Plus is a useful way of dealing with your own candidates' responses and unpicking and evaluating performance from session to session. And it provides a variety of ways of analysing what's happening across questions and across sessions of papers. Access to scripts is really useful. You're able to access your own candidates after, obviously, the exam session is shut, and you will be able to then download those scripts as a PDF. So they can be really useful tools for future groups in terms of looking at if you have a candidate that could probably provide a model response, you can probably fish it out, for example. Equally, if you're thinking about looking to address a particular AO, and if you're seeing a pattern, you can pull some papers and sort of use that as centre-specific assessment for learning. There are paid resources that are sort of directly addressed to Pearson, but clearly there are resources beyond from other sources too. If you are looking for further supports, I know there were some ideas and suggestions last time, and I've passed those through to Claire. Claire Haviland for English at teachingenglish@pearson.com is a really helpful subject partner support. So you can make contact with Claire on a range of issues. You can contact her regarding assessment or regarding any suggestion you might want to make about future contents or future resources to be posted on the website. There is also the Pearson Professional Development Academy, and this can be work that we can do at our own pace. And again, there are some units there relating to A-level English, and it allows delegates, or it allows other members of your team to go on in small bite-sized chunks at their own leisure and to work through some CPD. So there are some useful units on there, and it's quite nice that you can kind of pick it up and do it in small bite-sized chunks and work your way through if you're unable to get the time to attend the larger sessions. We can sign up to the newsletters, which will provide information on updated resources or any spec changes or refinements, which is always useful to know. And it can be sort of something that just keeps you in the loop. I would just like to thank everyone once again for devoting their time and concentration today. I know it's a very busy time of year, so I do thank you for your attendance today. And I would just like to wish everyone a pleasant day and hopefully a good week. So I thank you once again for all of your attention, and I would like to wish everyone a good day wherever they may be. If there are any sort of pressing concerns or questions, if you want to pop those just quickly into the chat box, we will remain for a moment or two and I can just have a look and try and make a response if I can. If not, I can certainly refer those forward for you. But just once more, thank you for attending and for giving me your time. And I do hope some of this has been of use, and do have a lovely week and a lovely remainder of term. So I'll say bye for now. Thank you very much.